Welcome to the Holiness Today podcast. On today's episode, listen to a conversation I have with newly elected Director of Nazarene Discipleship International, Dr. Sam Barber. In our conversation, Dr. Barber shares of his ministry experience and of his dedication to discipleship. In this conversation, we also talk about his book, A People of Grace, which introduces a new and effective discipleship model that guides Christians along the path of effective accountability for both themselves and those they will lead to a deeper understanding of Christ. This book was published by the Foundry in 2023, and a link in the show description will direct you to this resource. You will also see in the show description a link for Dr. Barber's workshop he gave at General Assembly in 2023, in which he discusses this book and in how local churches can adopt a Wesleyan model of discipleship for the 21st century. Dr. Barber, excited to have you on the Holiness Today podcast. You've been on our podcast before. I kind of recorded you with a 5-minute warning at General Assembly, and then we used your Journey of Grace recordings. You've been on the podcast as a local church pastor, as a district superintendent, and now as the new NDI Director. So you've got a local, district, soon-to-be global perspective. Just tell us a little bit about that transition. In my perspective, it felt like you guys were just with us in Kansas, moved to Ohio, and then elected to the director position. But how are you doing in this transition?
Well, we're doing great. But it is, you are right. It is something that happened rather quickly. As I think back to that, I really enjoyed being a pastor. In fact, I think that's the greatest job in the church. My theory is there aren't promotions after that. Like being a pastor is the high point, and then the little phrase I was thinking about the other day is I think there are just permissions after that, so then you kind of get permission from God to do something else. So
yeah,
we were happy to be a DS and enjoyed that very much. In fact, surprisingly enjoyed that. I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I did, but we really did enjoy it. And then it feels like often God interrupts us. We just kind of keep our heads down and do what we're doing the very best we can. And then something appears, and that's when you have to really dig in and be sure that that's God speaking and not, some other voice.
You grew up as a pastor's kid, is that correct?
Yeah, sure
So,
did.
but you didn't sense the call to ministry until a little bit later in life. I was listening to a podcast with you, and you said you wanted to be a computer science major so you could buy a BMW, I think is how you put it. So you could.
Wow, you've been in the archive somewhere.
I've been digging down, but how did God call you? What was that like, calling you into, hey, I'm going to use you in ministry? Share that a little bit.
Yeah, it's probably not dissimilar to a lot of people. I grew up around it, and honestly, my heroes as a kid were usually pastors and evangelists. They were just people that we got to know and spend good time with outside of even the church setting, in our home, around restaurant tables. But I really think part of my impulse as a younger man was from, we didn't have a lot growing up. And so I thought I'd really like to have some things. And the BMW is kind of the funny story, because it was just, at that point in my life, I couldn't imagine a more awesome machine, So I think the impulse was, I'm going to make some money. And so, it was the late 80s, early 90s. And so computer science was just really hot. And it was clear that if you could get into that field, probably the sky's the limit. And it was right. My problem is I was terrible at math.
Yeah.
So, when you're going to be a computer science major, math needs to be key. And I made it through, but I wasn't great. So I struggled with that. And every time I would think about going away to college and, what kind of profession would I have? I had a lot of inner turmoil. And a Sunday night church, our local church, my dad preached, I have no idea about what. And, but at the end, he gave an invitation and I went forward. And I remember that my mom came to pray with me. Usually she worked the altar, with other people, but for whatever reason, maybe I was the only seeker. She came and knelt beside me, didn't say a lot. But it was clear in that moment that God was speaking to me about ministry. And when I said yes to that in that moment of prayer, I had a sense of peace. And from that moment on, that's how God has been very clear with us. When we don't have peace, we know something's amiss. But when God sends that peace, even though there's change and things ahead, a deep settled inner peace, that's how we know God's speaking. And I learned at that moment. So I was a senior in high school, I'm 18 years old, quite a bit older than that now, and God has been working that way ever since.
Peace led you through those decisions in life.
Yeah, exactly.
You went to Mount Vernon and you studied psychology. Is
I
that
did.
was that wrestling? Did you still kind of, I don't know if I want to do ministry yet, or maybe God's going to use me in the psychological field, or what was that decision based on?
You know what? I think just maybe not the best advice. I, at that time in my life, I didn't have a ton of voices, entering in. I didn't even think about what college I would go to. I just knew it was going to be Mount Vernon. I was just such a Nazarene kid that this is how I'm going to go. And someone said to me, "Oh, I don't know if I would be a religion major. Maybe you should do something related." And I was like, "Okay." There wasn't a ton of thought. I'm ashamed to say it now. And so what wound up happening was that I had a religion minor, which served me well. At that time, the religion minor at Mount Vernon was pretty significant. And so I got a lot of courses done. But really, it didn't have anything to do with running at that point. I think it was just like not following probably the best advice.
Do you feel like
It's
God has,
well, but
yeah, I was gonna say, you feel like God has used that psychology background in your
yeah, oh,
ministry
for
then?
sure, for sure. I think the frustration was that it meant when I got out of Mount Vernon, I had a lot of course of study type things to do. Now, and I could have gone straight to seminary. I elected not to do that, went another route. But so I wound up having to do kind of a lot of work that I could have done when I was a student.
At what point in your life did you re-enter back into graduate school? After you'd served in the local church
Mhm.
pastor setting for a little bit?
Yeah, I came out of Mount Vernon, got a job as an associate pastor, did that for a couple of years, then got married, and we were invited. We were appointed at our very first church. So it was a tiny little church, and it was one of those we affectionately call it the Sam and Jill show. Jill's my wife's name, and there just wasn't a whole lot of other resources. So if it was going to be done, we were going to do it. I led the singing, she played the piano, she worked the nursery, we taught Sunday school, drove the van. Well, a little bit of time in that, probably year 3 as a lead pastor, I realized, people are asking questions and I'm not sure I have the answers. So just down the road, there was a Friends university, college at that point, Malone College. They offered a master's degree in Christian ministry. And a friend of mine was nearby serving a church. And so we enrolled together and went through that course together. So I was, we had jobs, we had a son, and then I went back to school. And it's been that way ever since. All of the work since Mount Vernon has been in a setting with family and other responsibilities.
And then when you went on to Duke, did you guys move to North Carolina, or so how did what was that phase? Was that right after Malone? Was there some time in between?
Yeah, no, in fact, at Malone, I had 3 professors who were Duke people, and they were amazing. I think the analogy I used to use, it was like someone ran through my head, and in all the rooms in my brain flipped on lights, and I didn't even know those rooms were there. Suddenly, I just wanted to learn everything. It was a real crazy time. So I had these Duke professors at Malone, and I just thought, I've got to go to Malone. I mean, I've got to go to Duke to study. So I asked one of them, should I do this? And he said no. But that didn't matter. We sold everything we could, packed up everything we had in a U-Haul and moved down there we didn't live in Durham. We lived close by so that I could commute.
Yeah.
Those were great years, some of our most difficult years as a family and certainly as a student, but boy, really richly rewarding years.
So what professor, class, book, maybe all three that kind of just uh, foundational is not the right word, but sticks out to you as like this kind of changed how I thought about ministry, discipleship, myself, God? Was there anyone that just sticks out to you through your history of education?
I had Richard Hayes as a New Testament professor at Duke, and he was a sincere believer at that time and was very open to inviting us outside the classroom to, have a brown bag lunch or sit in his office and talk about baseball and talk about the Lord. his voice was important during those years. Stanley Hauerwas was an important influence, although he was at Duke when I was there, but I didn't have him for class. I had his teaching assistants quite a bit. And so that, you know, a renewed understanding, a little deeper understanding maybe than I had experienced coming up in Nazarene churches, began to open doors. Probably the book, this is going to sound a little odd maybe, but probably the book that changed my life more than anything else would be the Book of Common Prayer or one of its variants, because I was not exposed to the more liturgical side of the church growing up. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the church I grew up in. It's just that there was more than I understood. And so when I began to learn about the lectionary and the daily office and some of those ways, it enriched my life so much that it kept pulling me deeper, I think, in. Until this day, I still use, some version of the daily prayers to guide my devotional practice. And in fact, someday I'd love to figure out how to talk or write about that, because it's been incredible the way God has used his word just to guide my path across the years. It's uncanny. It's if I started to detail all of the instances, people think they might not believe how incredibly on point God's word can be in our daily lives. And I'm very, very passionate about that. You can tell. That would probably be the book. If you're talking about a written book that really got a hold of me, and I maintain it to this day. So, 20 some years later, still 26 years later, I guess, still working through day after day, and God's Holy Spirit speaking faithfully.
What was that transition like in your life, moving from more of a not using a liturgy into liturgical practice? Did you have any pushback throughout your career as a pastor?
Not very often. I didn't abandon sort of the practices of our church as I understood them growing up. I just tried to add to. And so a lot of times I would be preaching like through the liturgical year, but the church didn't even know it. Sometimes I would talk about it, maybe Advent or Lent or something like that. But oftentimes, pastors choose a passage and they preach. If they're preaching biblically, I hope they are. And so I was just choosing the passages in that range of passages that are offered week by week. One of the fun things we did for a while is, and there's some people still continuing this work as I had started it once, but giving the congregation those weekly passages as devotional passages throughout the week, so that they're reading passages leading up to Sunday when you're going to preach on the Sunday text. That was a lot of fun, and I think our churches enjoyed that. I didn't get too much pushback at all because I was careful not to say one is better than the other. I just tried to let them inform one another. And I think that's probably, if I were giving advice to someone, I think that would be the advice I would give. Let those inform one another and kind of work them together, those two mindsets or two ways of coming at it.
So I read a statement in the Nazarene news article, and I also saw a sticker. It looks like there's some stickers going around I need to get. Discipleship is the heart of the gospel. When did God kind of start? Is that something you always, as a child, as a pastor's kid, were just aware of, and then you became aware of the fact that you're aware of it? Or is that something that clicked at a point in your ministry? Or how did this emphasis on discipleship take root in your heart?
No, it was not something I grew up with as a kid. Like, I wasn't thinking about that so much. I always have had a heart for the Lord. But I had probably been a lead pastor, maybe 10 years or more, 15 years maybe. And I started to look around at how busy I was and how busy our church was, and realized that we were good at a lot of things, but we weren't particularly good at the thing that Jesus was very clear about, making disciples. And so I began to ask that question: why aren't we doing better at that? Or what's happening here that this isn't happening? And I just got really captivated by trying to take seriously the Great Commission and what that would look like in my personal life, and then in the life of the church. And as a pastor, I had an opportunity kind of directly to influence the congregation in that direction. So I had some really sort of clumsy beginnings, I'm sure. Um, and, tried, I think every pastor tries a variety of ideas and programs or whatever to try and make something happen. And I did too. But um, I was invited to a couple of opportunities to study in different places with different people who had great influence over me. It's ironic. Woody Stevens was the director of SDMI at that time. I was in Kansas City, he was in Kansas City, and he invited me to join him in this program called the Bonhoeffer Project from Bill Hall, who is some people will recognize that name, a discipleship author from the past. And so we jumped into that program together, and that really fanned the flame. Bill Hall at that time was calling that group discipleship first people, just people who, worship services are good and everything else, it's all good, but we're Great Commission kind of folks. And so being immersed in that environment for a while as a pastor was really good. And then, of course, from there, I went to NTS finally to do the doctorate in spiritual formation and discipleship. And so all of those things, Dean Blevins has been a tremendous influence on my life. He's kind of Mr. Discipleship, in our denomination. But yeah, that it was a hunger and a lack that I saw in the church that drove me to dig in to the concept of discipleship.
So was your D-Men project on discipleship? Was that related, or when did you start getting the ideas to write the book, A People of Grace? Was that kind of all interconnected around that same time period?
Yeah, it sure was. So what I noticed as a pastor was that there weren't a lot of, at that time, when I began thinking about this, there weren't a lot of discipleship programs or even books written from a Wesleyan perspective. They were sort of generally evangelical, which often had a lot of Reformed influences and other things. And so I thought, well, someone should write something about discipleship from a Wesleyan perspective. Well, as soon as you begin to study Wesley, it's not very long until you run into the class meeting, the band meetings. And so I just began to dig right there. And again, a word of kindness to Dr. Blevins, who was so patient with me and helping me unearth all of these resources, introducing me to people to help me think. But the idea was to create something for my local church at the time that would help us as a congregation get at the Great Commission. And so I discovered Wesley's passion for the class meeting, where he said essentially this phrase, and they began to watch over one another in love. And the concept for Wesley, if you ever read about him, you'll recognize he was all about some accountability in a loving and vulnerable environment. And so that's the way his class meetings worked. And they changed the course of history in England in the 18th century. Well, it's not so easy to just transplant something from like that into the 21st, but the concepts were there. And I really think that the church has all but abandoned kind of a loving accountability. We're afraid to be too much or to come on too strong, but our culture has rediscovered it. And in a variety of places, weight loss programs, getting fit programs, recovery programs, even educational models, the idea is come together and ask some people to help you. And when you do, that goal that you have gets done. And I think the same thing is true in heart and life transformation. When we are willing to be vulnerable enough to make ourselves accountable to a group of people, the growth that we've never been able to see before, we will see. So that's the impetus. That was the dissertation. In fact, it was called Watching Over One Another in Love. And that wound up getting, I was able to rework that and to use parts of that and all in the book, A People of Grace.
And from what you said about that, if there was one word that connects it all, or the point of it all of the book, would be accountability.
Yes.
Or maybe a better way to put it is, what is lacking in the Christian church is accountability. And you've connected to discipleship and discipline.
Yeah.
I think about the things that I do to keep myself accountable. You mentioned health and dieting, going to the gym. Sometimes It's usually not fun. It's the not fun aspect. Towards the end of the book, you talked about kind of being willing to have someone talk about your behavior. But how do you talk about it through the book, but just a little bit here, how do you get a 21st century church to be okay with maybe hearing each other's faults? Are you willing to listen to each other's faults, to use Wesley's question there?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just having lunch with a pastor and we were having this same discussion. Like, I think it has to do with hunger and desire. When a person who's a follower of Jesus is hungry enough or realizes I have had 50 stops and starts, and I really want God to change me from the inside out. That's the person who is ready to be vulnerable and to be accountable. There was a period in my life as a pastor, in fact, for the very first many years, where I was afraid to be very vulnerable with others. I always felt like if I confess that I don't know this, everyone will think I'm dumb, or I should already know this, or I can't tell them I'm struggling. And I went through kind of a low period, and coming back off of a sabbatical, I had read some stuff by Henry Cloud, his boundaries work at other things. And I actually took a course there. And without boring you, at the end, the invitation was get a group of people around you who will be, I just called them Team Sam, which sounds a little arrogant. It wasn't my intention, but I was just trying to find some people who I could be vulnerable with. And, every person I asked said, of course, I'd love to do that. And there were some parameters around that. It changed my life. The things where I was struggling, the discouragements I had, the questions that I couldn't get answered, I began to find some people who were willing to invest in me and help me. And I realized the power of a group of people who really love you is incredible. And the church has that ready-made. See, that's what's so beautiful. It's right here. We just have to recognize a little tiny course correction, and we can unleash the power of that works in tandem so beautifully with the Holy Spirit. The New Testament is a book about us. It's very little about me and Jesus. It's about the people of God and Jesus. There's certainly an individual component, absolutely. But we're supposed to walk this journey together. And when we do, we're a lot better at it, in my opinion.
And I wrote it down because there's a great line in the book. Our salvation is personal, but it's not private.
Yeah.
Personal, but it's not private. And go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. I
was just going to say, I try to be very clear about that because I still believe in a personal decision to be a follower of Jesus. Jesus still went to individual people and said, follow me. And they had to decide, am I in or out? So there is a personal component to it. But when we then try to practice it all by ourselves, it's just not going to go very well because it's not designed that way. We're not designed that way as humans. God didn't create us that way. Neither did he create the church to operate that way.
Do you feel this is going to be kind of more of a devil's advocate, maybe would be not good to say on a Christian podcast, but do you feel that in the Church of the Nazarene that how our doctrine of entire sanctification has been articulated, not our doctrine of entire sanctification, but how it's been articulated, sometimes is a limiting factor in people being vulnerable, afraid to kind of share mistakes, for lack of better words, or things that they're struggling with? What has been your perception of that in the local church, and then as you're kind of moving through this journey to the global church?
I think maybe it has. I don't think it was intentional. I'm thinking about the church I grew up in. I had really good, teachers and I heard good preaching. But I don't recall anyone really talking about walking it out sort of together very often. So that's an important component that I think might have been missing. And I do think you're onto something there when we set up gospel and entire sanctification to sort of be a quick fix or a second trip to the altar and everything's good to go. I think we've shortcutted the process there. I was alive, and I can remember being in places where it was revolutionary to hear a leader in the Church of the Nazarene remind us that it was both a crisis and a process, this business of sanctification. Mm-hmm. Because for the longest time, the emphasis was on the crisis. And again, I'm not discounting that. I think there is a moment of decision. But in addition to that, there is then this growth process. And really, the book I wrote and the dissertation I wrote is getting at that. So how do we cultivate that season of growth, which is a lifelong season? Well, those are the things I lay out in the book.
Well, and I think you illustrate well that although we love the theology of John Wesley, his gift to the Christian world is his Methodism, but his methodologies.
Yeah.
And it's a hard time reading Wesley and saying he didn't understand that believers need that accountability and fellowship, meaning assuming they're struggling with things, and I think it was in your workshop at GA you mentioned you might be in a accountability group and someone's struggling with alcohol, and you'll say, "Hey, I'm not struggling with that." But what fix are you struggling with? Scrolling on your screen, watching too
Maybe.
much TV, maybe not taking discipleship. But yeah, I think it came out really well in the book that there is a not works righteousness, but a working out of our salvation that the Spirit does in us in community. So that was my takeaway, is that you really see that Wesley is working through grace in community with others.
Yeah.
You did a good
The
job drawing
concept
that
of the
out.
means of, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, go ahead.
The concept of the means of grace that Wesley, he didn't invent the term, but he really is the one, I think, for us, especially, who defined it best. What he wants to say there is that there are ways that God has chosen to pour out grace into our lives. But that's an invitation. That's not just this passive thing where we're like, well, now I am graced, and so I'm better. No, we then cooperate with that grace. It's kind of a breathing in, breathing out, or it's a way in which God pours himself out into us and then invites us to respond to that. Maddox's book, Responsible Grace, says this better than anyone I've found. But at any rate, this concept that you're describing is really how Wesley talked about the means of grace, which is another topic for another day, but it's one I love also.
So yeah, so then you outline the kind of the institutional means of grace, and then Wesley, you hit home on the prudential means of grace in the
Yeah.
book. But yeah, no, as I read through the band meeting questions, I thought, man, these hit hard. Are you willing to see your faults? Are you willing to be told of your faults? But just share a little bit about that. Like, we can't know. It's weird thinking about blind spots. I'm not going to know if there's a blind spot unless I'm willing to recognize what I'm seeing might not be the whole picture, and
Yeah.
I can't do that in isolation. So kind of just a little bit about how is the covenant formation group model, has that been developed since you wrote the book, or how are you seeing that develop?
Yeah. So the timing for the book's release was a little bit awkward because I had just left the local church. So
Yeah.
all my test subjects were suddenly someone else's, someone else was their pastor. So I didn't feel like I could continue to do that. But before even I had worked out all the kinks in that, we were able to have a couple of groups in the local church. And really, at the end of the day, if you use a model similar to what I wrote about or something else, I think what matters is that loving accountability in a vulnerable environment, because that's what has the power. So Wesley set it up in a certain way, and I tried to retradition that, into a way that fit in the 21st century. But the concept of owning up to this thing I'm really struggling with, if I really want to get over it, if I really want to, it's like people with addictions who finally join up with AA or NA or Celebrate Recovery or whatever. When they get tired of failing at that enough and say, I really want to get better this time, it should not surprise us that it takes that decision and the help of others. So if we're going to be holy, then when we decide we want that, and we know that we've failed so many times before, I think then we're willing to say, here's an area or two where I could really use just somebody to say, how's it going? And I want to talk about that, and I want you to pray for me on that issue. So the covenants, I think, I'm having a discussion right now with a group I'm going to go speak at soon, and they're trying to decide, do they want to stick to the covenant formation as I designed it or wrote about it anyway? Or do they want to have a little different model? And my answer is, you know what? Both are good. Just don't leave out the accountability part, because that's where I think the power is.
So a segue on that. This is one of the questions I wrote down to ask you. Do you think that's something that you'll pull into NDI, kind of start emphasizing the covenant formation groups for local churches? Because as you said, it was kind of an awkward time. You were just moving out of the local church. But have you given some thoughts to that maybe being an emphasis that you'd like to push as a director?
I don't know yet. That's the real honest answer. I do know that at my core, I'm a pastor. So I have a pastor's heart. I see the world through pastor eyes. And so we have a denomination wide lack, I guess. I hope it's not a surprise to know that the Great Commission and the making of disciples is important to us, and it's squarely in our mission statement, but we're not exactly knocking it out of the park there. We want to. So as a pastor, I'm always thinking about, well, what would it take to do that? And my answers almost always start with individuals, as if I were a pastor of a church. What can I build into your life that's going to help you accomplish these things? So I think there will be a formational answer, a spiritually formational answer to what I think is needed in the church. Yes. I don't exactly know how, I don't necessarily want to say that my idea is the best idea or the only one. Certainly it isn't. There are lots of great things that we can do, but I think they're all going to have a component of, as an individual believer, I'm linking arms with others and I'm serious about being a follower of Jesus. And so we're going to work on that together. I think that will be a key component. Yes. Whether or not it looks like a covenant formation group, I couldn't say, but there will be a together following Jesus component for sure.
And another segue here, but another takeaway from the book is that you're a motorcycle enthusiast. You own a Harley Davidson.
I do.
So when did that happen in your life? When did you get into biking?
I'll try to keep this short. My dad was a motorcycle rider. He had Honda Goldwings my whole childhood growing up. So I rode on the back quite a bit. And we actually moved to North Carolina when we were studying at Duke. And so when I graduated, my wife bought me a very old Honda motorcycle. It's what we could afford. And my dad and my uncle rode from Ohio down to North Carolina, and we had one day to ride together on the Blue Ridge Parkway, which was incredible. Well, a little bit of a sad note. My dad passed away shortly after that of cancer. So I got one day of riding with him, but the bug had bitten. I mean, I loved it. I loved everything about it. So I've had motorcycles through the years. And when my son got old enough to ride and showed an interest, we just thought about all the things I didn't get to do with my dad. And so he and I take these long journeys whenever we can
That's
out
great.
west and other places. And we love it. So I've had a bike since the year 2000. So now 24 years. And in fact, rode it today, unfortunately, to the repair shop, but I did ride it today.
Were you guys getting some rain up there today? Is that okay?
I wish. It's very
Yeah,
dry where I
so
live.
did I. We got a ton of rain here in Kansas a bit ago.
That's what
So
I heard.
yeah,
Jeff
ton of
Spangler's basement flooded.
yeah, there was some flash flood warnings and whatnot. So it was pretty crazy. On that note, a question that I think I know the answer to, but some of our audience would like to know: Are you planning on moving back to Kansas, or are you going to stay in Ohio?
Yeah, we plan to stay here in Ohio. The job that the NDI director does works very closely with the GMC employees in NDI, but also travels quite a bit. And so we can travel from anywhere. And, one of the fortunate results of the unfortunate COVID is the ability to do what we're doing right now to
Right,
connect this
right.
way. So we hope to be in Kansas City once a month with our team for several days. And then the rest of the time probably be traveling and all over the place.
All right, I'm going to throw some fun questions at you. This is also a takeaway from the book. You're a dog enthusiast as well, along with did I read that correctly? There were some good dog analogies in there.
You
Sounded
know what?
like
It
you
wasn't
adopted
until
some dogs.
Yeah,
Go
it
ahead.
wasn't
Sorry.
until after I read the book I realized, man, you talk about dogs all the time.
No, I loved it. I loved it. So, but do
Yeah,
you own a
if
dog
we
now?
no, we got one about 6 months ago, a wonderful dog, and realized this cannot work. We're never home, and it wasn't fair to the dog, and so we went back to the breeder who actually had the person that wanted the dog when we got him, who just couldn't believe how fortunate they were to get him. So he's happy,
Uh-huh.
and I feel
Yeah.
better. Yeah, we love dogs. We just love your dog or our neighbor's
Yeah.
dog.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. Someone else's. You don't have to take care of it then.
yeah.
what would be your cheat meal if you had one, or where's your favorite place to get food, or what's your guilty pleasure as it relates to food?
Oh, I am a pizza guy. Um, I could eat pizza every single day. In fact, this year, just a few months ago, we bought one of those, backyard pizza oven things. And man, I'm loving that thing.
Yeah, I've thought
Yeah.
about that before. So we're renters right now, but once we get a house, that's something I'll have to try out. So
We bought the solo stove version and it's incredible. It's so easy. I've only dumped one in the floor. It's the only
just
disaster
one.
we
Do you have the large kind of scoop for it, or whatever they call that?
the peel.
The peel, is that what it's called?
Oh
Okay.
yeah, man. And you
You
launch
slide it
the
in there.
dough. I mean, there's this whole lingo around it. But yeah, we got all that. We bought the combo kit when we bought it, and we
That's
love it. We
great.
love to have a party. My wife loves to entertain.
Yeah.
And so it's really fun to have a bunch of people over and just be making
Just make
pizzas.
pizzas. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you make homemade pizza then? Do you
Yeah.
make the dough and everything? Okay.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Well, my wife makes the dough, but
Yeah.
I do everything
Do
else.
the
Yeah, she's
toppings and
good at
whatnot.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. So what has been your biggest challenge in ministry? And then what has been your greatest joy in ministry throughout your
Oh my goodness. Probably the biggest challenge would probably be balance. I'm my gift, my strengths finder says I am strategic achiever maximizer, positivity relater. So those top three mean the wheels are always turning and I want to get the most out of every single moment. So I tend to just do things all in. Um, so as a result, a lot of times I can tend toward overwork or even when I'm not working, getting the most out of a day off and being tired. It's probably balance would be the greatest challenge. And that the ironic thing is I learned to figure that out as a pastor with very good routines. But the minute I became a DS, all those routines got blown away. And now in this new role, I have a feeling it's going to be another challenge. So that'd be the greatest challenge, I suppose. The greatest joy, I think, well, I really do love to preach, but I really think the greatest joy would be one-on-one time with a person who's got questions about the faith, and I get the chance to just pour into them. As I was finishing up my time as pastor in Kansas, the Lord had wound up bringing me, I don't know, a half a dozen younger guys who were a part of the church. I don't know if I was a father figure or what, but we would hike a little bit or just meet for coffee or lunch or whatever. And I just had the opportunity to pour into them. And I loved that. And that same idea got carried over into being a DS because I would be able to pour into pastors in the same way, in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
So different questions, but the same sort of setup, just
Mm-hmm.
across the table, just really talking about real things together, praying for one another. That's the greatest joy for sure.
And so you'll probably get to do some of that as well, but you'll definitely get to preach a lot more, I would assume, if you're going to be on the road quite a bit more, but
I don't know. I think so.
or at
I'm sure
least
getting a
speak a
lot of
lot more.
yeah,
Yeah,
I'll get a
yeah,
lot of invitations for sure. It's been a
yeah,
little overwhelming. As soon as I don't know, as soon as these things, become public, then you
yeah,
start getting
for sure.
invitations
You
to come,
get
which
people
I'm
start
delighted.
writing.
I'll be happy to
Yeah,
do it. But
yeah. So you preach from the lectionary as a local church pastor, but as you're moving into this role, do you have a go-to text, book of the Bible that you enjoy preaching from or studying? You have a favorite?
not really. I again, the daily devotional life is the genesis or the birthplace of everything I do. That's vision, strategy, preaching, conflict resolution. It all is born right there. So most of the days now, God is planting seeds in that devotional time, and I've got my journal sitting right here. That's why I keep looking over there. I've got a journal just filled with the things that I feel like God might be saying to us, and they're starting to. I don't know. It feels like I'm looking through a really thick fog. Like I can't really see clearly what direction God might have for NDI yet, but I'm getting some little pieces. So that's been really fun. But yeah, I'm gonna build those messages and everything out of that personal devotional time. And which, by the way, sorry to go back to this,
No,
but
go ahead.
is still guided by the lectionary in some sense, because those passages are daily, this kind of passages.
In the Church of the Nazarene, sometimes we talk about the divide between the schools, the professors, and the local church and whatnot. But in the local church, do you notice a divide or a difference between what I would call targeting for, targeting your elder, your pastors, and then your lay people? Is there any division there? Thinking about it from a curriculum perspective, and as you're getting into NDI, have you been kind of rethinking about bridging the gap between the pulpit and the pew at all? And that may be an awkward question, but I've been thinking about the 96%. A lot of times in Holiness Today, we think 4% of our audience is about pastors, and another 96% of the people in the pew. Are we making sure we're hitting those? So just didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, or spent thinking about that.
Well, it's interesting that you say the phrase "the people in the pew," because from the moment I started talking about this being, working with NDI, I love the journey of grace. I think that model, and I think Dr. Rainey did an incredible job of helping to not only flesh that out and create that, but then talk about it in the church. I feel like my mandate is getting the journey of grace to the pews. In other words, the average Nazarene person, the 96%, I didn't realize those numbers.
I could be making those up. It's above 90. I did the math in my head, and I think it's about 96 in USA, Canada, but I could be way off on that.
60% of all statistics are made up.
Exactly, especially mine. No, go ahead.
Yeah. But anyway, the idea is it's a beautiful concept. It's a beautiful framework. But what does it mean for the persons who attend our churches? This is the question that I'm asking. When I said, like, this pastor, I had lunch for a different reason, but I said, hey, can I ask you some NDI questions? And I just started peppering him with these questions, because I think we have to get these beautiful concepts. They have to become, the phrase that I have been using is mobilized through our people. My administrative director is an ex-military guy, so he says operationalize. He likes that phrase. But the idea is, how do I get the average Nazarene who's shown up at church and they really do love the Lord? How do they embrace what the journey of grace is all about in their everyday lives?
Just some closing thoughts on your end, but what is as you're moving into this role, what, you shared a little bit what God's placing on your heart, but just in a more general sense, what is your hope for the Church of the Nazarene? What are your prayers?
I really believe God would be pleased if we found a way to better accomplish what he says in the Great Commission. I think we're very good at so many things. The church is so good at many things. But I think it's time that we, and the Church of the Nazarene has done this even in our mission statement, but that we prioritize the making of disciples. Because I think the revival that we all seek and that we hear people praying for and longing for, I think it may not necessarily have to come through preaching services, although that's fine. But I think God's intention may be to bring that through people like you and me, who begin to take seriously this journey of grace, this Great Commission, and begin to see the people in our circles of influence changed by that. I think that's where real and lasting revival comes from. It's always up to God. God can do what God wants, but it seems to me that the scriptures are all pointing toward that. And I think the Lord is waiting on us to step into being and making disciples.
Well, Dr. Barber, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. I'm excited for your new role. It's always sad to see a good friend like Scott Rainey go, but I'm excited to see you come into this role, and it'll be fun to connect. We don't have to do much work on the old Journey of Grace videos, because both you and Scott were in those. So
that's right.
Keep it as it. So
yeah, we were. I just remembered.
Made it easy for us. No, I'm kidding. But no, I'm excited for more of these collaborations going forward. So excited for your new role. Thank you for sharing this time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to chat with you today. And Scott's a dear friend, and I'm a big fan of his. So I know those are big shoes to fill, but God will help us.
Thank you for listening to the Holiness Today podcast. If you enjoyed this production and wish to hear more, visit holinesstoday.org/podcast or find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts.